Up, everybody? Welcome back to class. Okay, here we are with part 5 of the JFK Presidency lecture series. Now, JFK, most of the notes that I would have given you so far probably would fit better into the Cold War era notes page, looking at foreign policy stuff. I think kind of ironically, like JFK, his weak spot, like politically, like when we were talking about like the election of 1960, his weaker spot was kind of like people weren't quite sure if he was up to the task of standing up to the communists. And he was seen as pretty strong on domestic policy and like relating to people and civil rights reform. But JFK probably gets more well remembered for a lot of the foreign policy stuff, like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs and the famous speech he gave in Berlin when the Berlin Wall was getting built. So it's kind of like sometimes politicians, they have a weak spot and then they have to overcompensate. And then plus a lot of big Cold War stuff happened in the 3 years that he was president. Now, remember, if you go back to the election of 1960, Kennedy was the first Democrat in history that got a large majority of the black population's vote. So he was seen as, he was very popular with, the black demographic group, with black Americans. He made quite a few promises about civil rights reform and was seen as a guy who was very friendly to like the civil rights movement. But he's a Democrat, and back in this time, it's not quite like today. Some things, weird things have happened where the political parties have kind of inverted over time, and it was happening in the 1960s. A lot of the people that were the most pro-segregation, that wanted to keep things split up, were Southern Democrats. Now, Kennedy's a Democrat, but he's a Northern Democrat from Massachusetts. He was from a Union state where they never had slavery. But there were a lot of Democrats down South that are just have a whole different way of looking at things, like with domestic policy. Now, Kennedy, when he had gotten elected in 1960, he was able to patch together a coalition of Northern and Southern Democrats to end up beating Richard Nixon and getting elected in that epically close election. Now, when we're fast forwarding to kind of a couple years into his presidency, he, like any president, is starting to think about his reelection campaign. And he is worried that if he pushes too far too fast with civil rights stuff, that he's going to lose a lot of those the Southern Democrats that are not in favor of integration and are definitely a little bit more racist and kind of want to keep their segregated way of life. He's worried a lot of the Southern states will break away and that he won't get a second term in office. So moving on here, getting into the nuts and bolts of JFK and civil rights. What does he accomplish, or what does he do and contribute to the civil rights movement in the 3 years that he was president? He definitely pushes for voting equality. Now, the Voting Rights Act does not get passed until 1965, over a year after Kennedy has been assassinated. However, I think it's highly likely that if Kennedy had lived and gotten a second term in office, he probably for sure would have pushed for the voting rights bill. And basically, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 essentially said you can't discriminate and have different standards for voting for black or white or man or woman or because of your ethnic group or religion or anything like that. I think that's pretty cut and dry. Kennedy probably would have supported that, and he made statements quite a few times through his political career where, he kind of advocated for that. Now, another thing, and this is totally speculation, but if Kennedy had won a second term in office, well, by this point in American history, you couldn't run for more than 2 terms as president. Presidents are term limited. After FDR had gotten 4 terms, then we passed an amendment to the Constitution that says 2 terms is the most any president's going to get. I think it's probably a reasonable assumption that Kennedy actually would have taken quite a bit more action in terms of civil rights reforms in his second term, because he wouldn't have been worried about reelection. Now, who knows if he had on the other hand, with what he does and the kind of the contributions he makes, maybe he wouldn't have even won a second term. That's playing the what if game. But I think if you were to ask me as a history guy that has studied this period of history pretty extensively, I think it's probably likely that Kennedy would have won a second term in office. And I think had he not been assassinated in his second term, he probably would have done a lot more to push for more civil rights reforms. Of course, doesn't play out that way because his life ends up getting tragically cut short, and we'll be covering the assassination in the final chunk of JFK notes. Now, other things that he did while he was president for 3 years, he does resist doing this a lot, but he did send federal troops down to aid the integration of Ole Miss. Ole Miss is a big SEC school. Some years they have a good football team. Some of you may have heard of them, but it's the big university in Mississippi. And remember, all the southern states had Jim Crow laws, but often Alabama and Mississippi get kind of called. They get thrown in as like the most southern states or the most kind of rigidly segregated states. So when James Meredith, who is a young black man who is like an Air Force veteran, when he applies and gets into the University of Ole Miss, it's kind of controversial, and there's a lot of backlash, and a lot of the white community in that area is totally opposed to integrating their university. He has death threats. There's angry crowds out there when he's showing up to class. So JFK, I think, rightfully sent down federal troops to kind of like protect him as that school was starting to get integrated. And then, of course, James Meredith was the first one, but then there's going to be many more black students that would follow him. But if you're the first person kind of breaking that glass ceiling, man, that can be a very precarious and kind of dangerous situation for you. So that was a good thing, I think, that Kennedy sent down National Guard troops to protect him. Now, in 1963, months before Kennedy is assassinated, it's kind of this. He gets assassinated in November of 63, but if you would rewind to the summer ahead of time, that was when Martin Luther King delivered his March on Washington and delivered the I Have a Dream speech. They invited Kennedy to speak there. However, he declined. Now, I think that would have probably been a pretty notable speech, and if he had accepted that offer and gone and kind of, held hands with Martin Luther King and like said, "I support his vision. I have a dream. I have a similar dream," or something like that to that effect, and thrown support behind Martin Luther King. That would have been a pretty big thing for Kennedy to have done. However, again, that gets back into he knows about a year away. He's got a re-election, and he's got his campaign he's starting to get working on. And he was worried that if he was seen as too friendly to guys like Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, that it could be a backlash, and that he might lose a lot of those southern states that he really needed to win in the Electoral College to get a second term in office. So Kennedy is very reluctant, even though I think probably in his personal life, I think he supported the whole vision of I Have a Dream and what Martin Luther King was doing there. I think he was supportive, but he had, he has to weigh out those political consequences. So he doesn't want to be seen as too friendly with the movement because he's still trying to keep the more pro-segregationist Southern Democrats together in his coalition of voters. Next up, he delivers. Now, this is something he does come through on. Shortly after the whole I Have a Dream speech, delivers a landmark civil rights speech where he goes on TV and talks to the American public and says, "Come on, America, we got to get our act together. We have to start treating black people better than what we are, especially in the southern states." Now, that was a little bit of a political gamble for him, but he does, I guess, throw caution to the wind, politically speaking, and he openly advocates for civil rights reform. So I think that was probably a good thing and a courageous thing that he did. Bottom line, to sum it up, many of the civil rights leaders, and here in this photo, you can see Martin Luther King and then John F. Kennedy, both there with other civil rights leaders and a few politicians in the mix. I think a lot of these guys, I think Martin Luther King was friendly with John F. Kennedy. I think they had a mutual respect for each other. However, Kennedy, and this is very common for lots of politicians, he made a lot of big promises when he's trying to get elected as president. And then, every president does that. They promise the world, and then they're able to deliver on kind of a small little chunk of all the things that they promised, because of course you have to deal with Congress and the courts, and it's a very complex and complicated job. Anyway, a lot of the civil rights leaders, I think, wish that Kennedy had done a little bit more and had advocated and pushed harder. And it's kind of speculation on my part, but I do think that had he gotten a second term where he didn't have to worry about re-election again, he probably would have done quite a bit more in his second term in office. It would have been really interesting to see if Kennedy had been a two-term president. I think he had some of the markings where he could have been a truly great American president, on the short list of best American presidents. But he doesn't really get the chance to follow through on a lot of that stuff, and it's left to speculation because of his assassination and the early end of his presidency. We really don't know how things would have panned out if he had been president for several years longer, another 5 years or so, on to what he had already had. Okay, that's all I've got for you for today. If you have any questions about JFK and how he tied into the civil rights movement, shoot me an email, and I'm happy to clarify and chat with you a little more about it.